The moment my daughter-in-law smiled too sweetly at me across that dining room table, I knew somebody in that house had already decided what to do with my life. My name is Helen Crawford, and at 68 years old, I had learned that real danger in a family never arrives shouting. It arrives carrying a casserole dish, wearing pearl earrings, and calling you Mom, in a voice just a little too cheerful. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon while I was watering the hydrangeas beside my front porch in Asheville, North Carolina. Vanessa had mailed it instead of texting, which already felt strange. Thick cream-colored envelope. Gold lettering. The Crawford Family Legacy Dinner. I remember standing there in my gardening gloves reading those words twice while the late September wind pushed dry leaves across the driveway. Legacy. Families only used words like that when they wanted something. Inside was a printed card asking me to arrive at 6 sharp on Saturday evening at my son Daniel's house. Formal attire requested. Vanessa had even added a handwritten note at the bottom in looping blue ink. We want to celebrate everything you've done for this family. That sentence should have made me feel loved. Instead, it sat in my stomach like cold coffee. Daniel and Vanessa had been married 12 years. Long enough for me to recognize the difference between genuine kindness and performance. Vanessa specialized in performance. She complimented people too quickly, laughed half a second too loudly, touched your arm while speaking as if she were always standing under invisible stage lights. The older I got, the more exhausting I found people like that. Still, Daniel was my only son. After my husband Robert passed away from heart failure 7 years earlier, I held on to family traditions harder than ever. Sunday dinners, birthday cards, Thanksgiving pies made from scratch. I told myself those things mattered because families needed roots. Looking back now, I think I was the only one still watering the tree. Saturday evening arrived colder than expected. I wore a navy blue dress Robert had once said made me look elegant without trying too hard. The drive to Daniel's neighborhood took about 20 minutes, and the entire way there I kept noticing strange little things I normally would have ignored. Vanessa hadn't called me all week. Daniel hadn't answered my voicemail from Wednesday. Even my granddaughter Lily, who usually texted me heart emojis every few days, had gone quiet. By the time I turned onto their street, the sky had darkened into deep gray blue, and every house glowed with warm porch lights except theirs. Their home looked bright enough to host a wedding reception. Cars lined both sides of the street. I counted at least 14 before pulling into the driveway. Through the front windows I could see silhouettes moving around holding wine glasses. Vanessa opened the door before I even knocked. "Helen," she said, stretching my name into something sugary and artificial. She air-kissed my cheek without actually touching me. "Don't you look beautiful tonight?" Her perfume hit me first. Expensive. Sharp floral with something heavy underneath. Vanessa always smelled like department store perfume counters. "You said formal attire," I replied with a smile. "I didn't want to underdress." "Oh, trust me," she laughed. "Tonight is very special." Those 4 words landed strangely. Not warm. Not emotional. Measured. Like lines rehearsed beforehand. The house was packed with relatives, neighbors, and a few people I didn't recognize. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Candles flickered along the dining room shelves. Someone had gone through a great deal of trouble. Yet within 30 seconds, I noticed something that made the back of my neck tighten. The framed family photos lining the hallway had changed. New pictures. New vacations. New Christmas portraits. In every single frame, Daniel, Vanessa, and Lily smiled brightly together. And in almost all of them I was missing. Not accidentally absent. Deliberately erased by time. Vanessa guided me toward the dining room with one hand lightly pressed against my elbow. "Everyone's so excited you're here," she said. But as I entered the room, conversations shifted awkwardly. A few relatives smiled too quickly before looking away. My cousin Marlene gave me one of those pitying expressions people wear at funerals. Daniel finally approached carrying a whiskey glass. "Hey, Mom," he said, hugging me with one arm instead of 2. Even his voice sounded distracted, nervous. He avoided eye contact almost immediately. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. "Of course," he answered too fast. Then Vanessa called his name from across the room, and he disappeared beside her without another word. That was when I realized something important. Whatever this dinner really was, Everyone else already knew except me. I have attended enough family dinners to understand when people are acting naturally and when they are performing for an audience, and that night every person in that house felt rehearsed. Vanessa guided me toward the dining room table with the same polished smile she used at church fundraisers and school events, the kind that looked perfect from far away but empty up close. "We saved you a special seat," she said brightly. I noticed immediately that my place was not at the center of the long dining table where Robert and I used to sit during holidays when he was alive. Instead, my chair had been placed near the far corner beside the kitchen doorway, close enough for waiters at a restaurant to pass through carrying dirty plates. It sounds like a small thing, but women my age notice small things because disrespect rarely enters loudly. It arrives quietly and waits to see whether you will pretend not to notice. I smiled anyway and took my seat. Across the table, my granddaughter Lily gave me a hesitant little wave before looking down at her phone. She was 16 now, old enough to understand tension but too young to challenge it. Vanessa clinked her wine glass with a spoon. "Before dinner starts," she announced, "I just want everyone to appreciate how wonderful it is having the whole family together again." Her voice floated smoothly through the room while people nodded and lifted glasses. Daniel stood beside her looking uncomfortable inside a charcoal gray blazer I had bought him last Christmas. He kept rubbing the back of his neck the way he used to as a teenager whenever he was hiding something. I watched him carefully while servers from a local catering company brought out plates of rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans almondine. Vanessa had never hired caterers before. Not even for birthdays. The entire evening felt too expensive, too organized, too intentional. "Helen," my cousin Marlene suddenly said from halfway down the table, "Vanessa told us you might be making some big changes soon." The room became strangely quiet after that sentence. Forks slowed. I shifted. Vanessa laughed softly and waved one manicured hand in the air. "Oh, nothing dramatic," she said. "We are just exploring options that would make life easier for Helen as she gets older." As she gets older. I took a slow sip of iced tea before answering. I was not aware my life needed rearranging. A few people looked down immediately. Vanessa kept smiling, but I noticed the tiny stiffness around her mouth. "You know what I mean," she replied sweetly. "Less stress. Less responsibility. Somewhere with support." Support. Another carefully chosen word. Daniel finally spoke up. "Mom, nobody is forcing anything. We are just trying to think ahead." I turned toward him fully. "Think ahead for whom?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. The conversation shifted after that, but the strange little moments kept piling up like pebbles in my shoe. My water glass stayed empty while everyone else received refills. Vanessa interrupted me twice whenever I tried joining conversations. One of Daniel's neighbors asked whether I still lived alone for now, as if someone had already briefed him on future plans involving my own home. Then came the moment that settled cold and heavy in my chest. Lily accidentally said, "Dad, did you already show Grandma the lake house brochure?" The second those words left her mouth, Vanessa's smile vanished for half a heartbeat. Daniel nearly dropped his fork. "Lily," Vanessa said sharply, "go check on dessert." The girl stood up immediately and hurried away looking embarrassed. Nobody explained the brochure. Nobody explained why my son suddenly looked pale. Instead, Vanessa stood gracefully from her chair and lifted her wine glass once more. "Actually," she announced warmly, "this is the perfect moment to share some exciting family news." And every instinct inside me whispered the same thing at once. Whatever they were about to say had already been decided without me. Vanessa stood at the head of the table holding her wine glass with both hands like a woman accepting an award she had practiced receiving in the mirror. The room became so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Even the jazz music seemed softer somehow. "Tonight," she began warmly, "is about family, planning for the future, and making sure the people we love are cared for properly." Several guests nodded politely. Daniel stared down into his drink. I sat perfectly still. "As many of you know," Vanessa continued, "Helen has been thinking seriously about simplifying her life." She turned toward me with that same polished smile. "And after many heartfelt conversations, we are happy to support her transition into a more comfortable living arrangement with professional care and less stress." My fingers tightened around my fork. For a moment I honestly wondered whether I had misunderstood the English language. Around the table, relatives smiled carefully at me the way people smile at someone recovering from illness. My cousin Marlene even whispered, "Good for you," under her breath. Good for me. As though I had announced a cruise vacation instead of hearing strangers discuss my future like I was no longer capable of deciding it myself. I looked directly at Daniel. "I am sorry," I said calmly. "Would someone like to explain when exactly I agreed to any of this?" Vanessa gave a light laugh that felt painfully rehearsed. "Helen, we talked about this after your checkup in June." "No," I replied softly, "you talked." I listened. The air shifted immediately. Several people lowered their eyes toward their plates. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom, nobody is trying to upset you. We are just concerned. The house is large. You are alone most of the time. We thought maybe a community setting would be easier." Easier. Another word people use when they want to remove you from your own life while pretending it is kindness. "I have lived in my home for 38 years, I answered. "I still drive myself to church, grocery shop alone, and manage every bill without help. So forgive me if I do not understand why everyone suddenly believes I am incapable." Vanessa stepped closer to Daniel as if they were presenting a united front. "Nobody said incapable," she replied quickly. "We only want what is best for you." There it was again. That tone. Sweet enough to fool people who did not know her well. But I had spent 12 years watching Vanessa speak differently depending on who was listening. Her kindness always seemed strongest when an audience was nearby. Then something happened that changed the entire evening for me. One of Daniel's business friends leaned across the table and casually said, "The lake property should really help offset assisted living costs anyway." The moment those words landed, my heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Because suddenly pieces began sliding into place. The missing family photos. The strange invitation. The brochure Lily accidentally mentioned. The awkward silence every time my house came up. They had not invited me there to discuss my future. They had invited witnesses. Vanessa immediately tried to smooth things over with another laugh. "Oh goodness, people are getting ahead of themselves tonight." But nobody sounded confused except me, which meant conversations had already happened behind closed doors. I looked around the room carefully and realized something chilling. Some of these people believed decisions about my home had already been made. Decisions involving property I still owned. Property sitting on nearly 4 acres outside Asheville with rising value every year. Property Robert spent decades paying for. I set my napkin beside my plate and smiled politely. "Excuse me for a moment," I said. Nobody stopped me as I walked toward the hallway bathroom. But halfway there I heard Vanessa whisper sharply behind me, low enough that she thought I could not hear it. "Daniel, she was supposed to know already." And my son answered with 5 words that settled into my chest like ice. "I thought the papers covered it." I stayed in the bathroom long enough to let the shock settle into something colder and more useful. Women my age survive by learning the difference between emotion and information. Emotion clouds you. Information protects you. I stood at the marble sink staring at my reflection beneath the soft yellow light. Navy blue dress. Pearl earrings. Makeup carefully applied before leaving home because somewhere inside me I still believed family dinners mattered. And out there beyond that bathroom door, my own son had just admitted there were papers involved in plans I knew nothing about. I washed my hands slowly even though they were already clean. Then I walked back into the hallway before anyone noticed how long I had been gone. Voices drifted from the dining room, but I stopped when I heard Vanessa speaking quietly near Daniel's office. "You said she signed everything after the cardiology appointment," she whispered sharply. "That was months ago." Daniel answered in a strained voice. "I thought she did. She signed a stack of forms at the hospital." Well, obviously something went wrong because she is acting like this is brand new information. I remained completely still beside the hallway archway. Years ago, Robert taught me something during a difficult business dispute with one of his contractors. He used to say, "The person who talks first usually loses." So I listened. "Maybe we pushed too fast," Daniel muttered. Vanessa gave a short, irritated laugh. "We do not have the luxury of waiting another 5 years for your mother to decide she is ready. The market is perfect right now." Do you know how much that land is worth? My stomach tightened, but my face remained calm. There it was. Not concern. Not care. Land. Value. Timing. I quietly stepped backward before they could see me, and returned to the dining room just as dessert arrived. Nobody noticed anything different except Lily. She looked at me carefully while placing a slice of cheesecake near my plate. You okay, Grandma? She asked softly.
I smilte her.
I am just tired, sweetheart. But inside my mind, memories had already begun rearranging themselves into new shapes. June. The cardiology appointment Vanessa mentioned. Remembered it clearly now. A long afternoon at Asheville Regional Medical Center after minor chest discomfort that turned out to be stress-related. Daniel had insisted on handling paperwork because the nurse kept bringing forms while doctors moved in and out of the room. I remembered signing discharge papers while exhausted and distracted. At the time I trusted my son enough not to question documents placed in front of me. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. Trust is expensive when given to the wrong people. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of artificial smiles and nervous laughter. Vanessa avoided speaking directly to me again. Daniel barely touched his food. Around 9:30 I finally stood and reached for my purse. Thank you for dinner, I said politely. Vanessa rushed forward immediately. Already leaving? It has been a long evening, I replied. Daniel walked me to the front porch while cold mountain air drifted through the trees. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, Mom, do not make tonight into something bigger than it is. I looked at my son standing under the porch light, 50 years old and still unable to tell the truth directly. That depends entirely on what you have done, I answered. His face changed at that sentence. Fear. Real fear. Not guilt. Not regret. Fear that I might finally start asking questions. I drove home through dark winding roads with both hands tight on the steering wheel. The minute I walked inside my house, I went straight to Robert's old study and unlocked the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, where I kept every financial document I owned. And for the first time in my life, I searched my own paperwork as if I were investigating strangers. I spent nearly 3 hours at Robert's old oak desk that night while rain tapped softly against the study windows. Every folder, every insurance paper, every bank statement sat spread around me beneath the warm yellow lamp he used to read under after dinner. Around midnight I finally found what I had been searching for. A photocopy from the hospital visit in June. Several pages clipped together beneath my discharge paperwork. First glance, everything looked ordinary. Signature lines. Medical release forms. Standard language most people never bother reading carefully. But halfway through the stack, I noticed something strange. Page numbers skipped. Page 3 jumped directly to page 5. I sat very still in my chair staring at that missing page number while a cold heaviness spread through my chest. Missing pages do not happen accidentally in legal paperwork. Especially not paperwork involving signatures. I pulled open the lower drawer again and searched for the originals. They were gone. Only the incomplete photocopy remained. That was the moment suspicion turned into certainty. By the next morning, grief had disappeared completely. What remained was clarity. At 8:30 sharp, I drove downtown to see Richard Bellamy, the attorney Robert and I had used for nearly 25 years. Richard was 72 now with silver hair, suspenders, and the calm voice of a man who had spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money. The minute I explained the situation, his expression changed. Helen, he said carefully, did you knowingly sign any property transfer documents this year? No? Any power of attorney agreements? No. He leaned back slowly in his chair. Then we need to pull every public filing connected to your property immediately. Within an hour his assistant returned carrying printed records from the county office. Richard adjusted his glasses while reviewing them, then looked up at me with visible concern. There was an attempted ownership transfer submitted 6 weeks ago. My entire body went cold. Attempted. It was flagged for incomplete notarization and never finalized. He slid the paperwork toward me. There was my signature near the bottom of the page. Or something that resembled it closely enough to frighten me. My hands remained steady as I studied it. Age teaches you something important about survival. Panic helps the other side. Calm protects you. Who submitted this? I asked quietly. Richard hesitated only briefly. Your son, Daniel Crawford. For several seconds I simply listened to the ticking clock on Richard's office wall. Not because I was shocked anymore. Deep down, part of me had already known. What hurt was realizing how long this must have been unfolding behind my back. The family dinner had not been the beginning. It had been the final stage of a plan already in motion. Richard folded his hands together. Helen, I strongly recommend we secure everything immediately. Property titles, trust documents, banking authority, medical directives. Quietly. I appreciated that word. Loud revenge is emotional. Quiet protection is intelligent. By lunchtime that same day, I had changed every legal authorization connected to my estate. By Friday afternoon, Richard helped me establish a revised trust that placed strict protections around the house and surrounding land. Nobody would be able to touch it without my direct approval again. Nobody. But I still was not finished. Because legal paperwork explained only part of the betrayal. I wanted to know how long Vanessa and Daniel had been discussing my future like a business transaction. So instead of confronting them, I did something much simpler. I listened. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid attention to everything. Every awkward phone call. Every forced invitation. Every conversation that stopped when I entered a room. Then one afternoon, entirely by accident, Lily unknowingly handed me the final piece. I had stopped by Daniel's house to drop off homemade soup because Lily had been sick with the flu. Vanessa was upstairs on a conference call, and Lily sat curled beneath a blanket watching television. As I placed the soup inside the kitchen refrigerator, I noticed a glossy real estate brochure lying open on the counter. Across the front was a photo of my property. The brochure looked professionally designed. Thick glossy paper with drone photographs of my land taken from angles I had never even seen before. The front page read, Prime Mountain Development Opportunity. Beneath the title sat a full-color image of my white farmhouse surrounded by rolling acreage and autumn trees. My home. My garden. Robert's workshop. The porch swing where Lily used to nap as a little girl during summer thunderstorms. Reduced to a development opportunity. I stood frozen beside the refrigerator while Lily coughed softly from the couch. Dad and Mom keep talking about that place, she said absent-mindedly without looking away from the television. They said somebody from Charlotte wants to build luxury cabins there. I closed the refrigerator door carefully. Did they now? Mom said it is worth a lot more than Grandma realizes. Children never understand when they reveal truths adults are trying desperately to hide. I picked up the brochure slowly, pretending mild curiosity instead of the cold anger moving through my chest. On the back page sat a realtor's business card attached with a paperclip. Nathan Holloway, luxury land specialist. There were handwritten notes in Vanessa's neat script along the margins. Potential subdivision access. Excellent resale value. Perfect retirement leverage. Retirement leverage. I almost smiled at the cruelty of that phrase. Not because it surprised me anymore, but because it sounded exactly like Vanessa. She always spoke about people the way investors speak about property. Useful. Strategic. Profitable. I slid the brochure back onto the counter moments before Vanessa entered the kitchen carrying her phone, and wearing that same polished expression she used whenever company was nearby. Helen, she said brightly, you did not have to bring soup all the way over here. Lily sounded miserable on the phone, I replied calmly. Chicken soup still fixes most things. Vanessa laughed softly, but I noticed her eyes flick briefly toward the brochure. Just 1 second. One nervous second. Then her smile returned. Daniel should be home soon, she said carefully. Maybe stay for coffee? I looked directly at her. No thank you. I should get back before dark. Something in my voice must have unsettled her because she immediately started talking too much, filling the silence the way guilty people often do. You know how stressful finances can become at our age, she said while adjusting pillows that did not need adjusting. Sometimes families simply need practical conversations before emergencies happen. Practical conversations. Another one of her soft little phrases designed to disguise greed as responsibility. Picked up my purse. You are absolutely right, I answered. Families should always be honest before making important decisions. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. For the first time since all this began, I think Vanessa realized I was no longer confused. I drove home slowly through the Blue Ridge foothills while the late afternoon sun turned the mountains gold. Somewhere along that winding road, my sadness finally disappeared. In its place came something far more dangerous: patience. Because I understood the situation clearly now. Daniel and Vanessa believed age had made me fragile, predictable, easy to pressure quietly into surrendering property before I fully understood its value. They thought I would avoid confrontation because older women are expected to remain polite no matter how badly they are treated. What they did not understand was that women from my generation survived by learning how to endure silently while paying attention to everything. And I had started paying very close attention. That evening I called Richard Bellamy again and asked him a simple question. If people believe they are about to inherit something, I said, how long do they usually keep pretending to care? Richard paused for a moment before answering carefully. Not nearly as long as they think they will. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat alone on my back porch wrapped in Robert's old flannel blanket, while crickets hummed across the dark property around me. 38 years earlier, Robert and I had bought that land with savings from extra construction jobs and second mortgages we could barely afford. We built our life there one careful paycheck at a time. And now strangers wearing my family's faces were discussing it over catered dinners and real estate brochures. But the most important thing was this. They still believed I knew less than I actually did. And that mistake was about to cost them everything. 3 weeks later, Vanessa announced another family gathering. This one was supposedly for Daniel's promotion at work and Lily's acceptance into an advanced academic program. A celebration layered on top of another celebration, exactly the kind of event Vanessa loved because it guaranteed a full audience. She called me personally this time. Helen, it would mean so much if you came, she said in that soft practiced voice. Family has felt distant lately. I almost admired her confidence. By then she and Daniel believed they had regained control of the situation. I had stayed calm, polite, cooperative. I never mentioned the attempted transfer documents, never confronted them about the brochure. I even accepted a few invitations to lunch afterward and listened quietly while Vanessa discussed retirement communities disguised as lovely lifestyle options. The more relaxed I appeared, the more careless they became. That was exactly what I wanted. The gathering took place on a chilly Saturday evening in November. Vanessa transformed the house again with candles, catered food, and expensive flower arrangements that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and roses. A large television screen had been mounted in the living room displaying a looping slideshow of family photographs, while jazz music floated through hidden speakers. Nearly everyone from the previous dinner attended along with several new faces from Daniel's office. Vanessa greeted guests in a dark green cocktail dress, while carrying herself like the hostess of a luxury hotel. Helen, she exclaimed dramatically when I arrived. You look wonderful tonight. So do you, I replied pleasantly. And she did. Vanessa always understood presentation. What she never understood was substance. I wore a cream-colored wool coat Robert once bought me during a winter trip to Vermont, and carried a small leather handbag resting calmly against my arm. Inside that handbag sat a flash drive and several printed documents. The entire evening moved exactly the way I expected. Vanessa stayed close to me in front of guests, constantly touching my shoulder or asking whether I felt comfortable enough. Daniel overcompensated with forced attentiveness, refilling my drink too quickly and pulling out chairs before I reached them. It was performance, not care. Around 8 o'clock, Daniel tapped his fork against a wine glass. Before dessert, he announced nervously, Vanessa prepared. Something special celebrating family memories. Applause filled the room while the lights dimmed slightly. Vanessa smiled proudly near the television screen. Just a little slideshow for everyone we love, she said warmly. The first photographs appeared exactly as expected. Vacation pictures. Christmas mornings. Lily growing up through the years. Guests smiled and laughed softly while sentimental piano music played through the speakers. Then the screen suddenly went black. Vanessa frowned immediately. Oh, she laughed nervously. I think the system froze. But it had not frozen. I knew that because 10 minutes earlier, while everyone gathered on the back patio for appetizers, I quietly handed the flash drive to Lily. Sweetheart, I told her gently, Would you mind plugging this into the television when the slideshow starts? It contains some older family photos I thought your father might enjoy. She never questioned me. The black screen flickered once before new audio began playing through the speakers. Vanessa's voice filled the room instantly. Clear. Sharp. Unmistakable. We do not have the luxury of waiting another 5 years for your mother to decide she is ready. The entire house went silent. On screen appeared scanned images of property brochures and county paperwork, while the recording continued. Do you know how much that land is worth? Vanessa's voice echoed through the room again. Someone near the kitchen gasped quietly. Daniel went completely pale. Helen, he whispered harshly, stepping toward me. But I remained seated calmly in my chair with my hands folded neatly in my lap. The recording continued playing. The market is perfect right now. Retirement leverage. She signed everything already. Every sentence landed heavier than the last. Vanessa rushed toward the television, fumbling for the remote while relatives stared at her in stunned silence. But the most painful moment was not her panic. It was watching Daniel lower his head because for the first time all evening, he finally looked ashamed. The silence after the recording ended felt heavier than shouting. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for food or wine or dessert. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the television screen still glowing against the wall. Vanessa stood frozen beside the entertainment cabinet, clutching the remote control so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Daniel stared at the floor like a man realizing too late that shame looks different when other people witness it. I rose slowly from my chair and smoothed one hand over my dress. No anger. No raised voice. At my age, dignity speaks louder than rage ever could. I did not come here tonight to embarrass anyone, I said calmly. I came because I wanted the truth in the room for once. Several guests looked visibly uncomfortable. My cousin Marlene would not even look at me anymore. Across the room, one of Daniel's co-workers quietly picked up his coat as if suddenly aware he should not have been there for any of this. Vanessa finally found her voice first. Helen, this is incredibly unfair, she snapped, her polished mask cracking for the first time. You recorded private conversations. Private conversations about my property, I answered evenly. Private plans involving forged paperwork and discussions about removing me from my own home. Daniel stepped forward quickly. Mom, nobody was trying to hurt you. I looked directly at him. Then why was I never told the truth? He opened his mouth but nothing came out. Because there was no explanation left that sounded decent in front of witnesses. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You are twisting everything. We were trying to help prepare for the future. No, iraplia sufli. You were preparing for my absence. The room fell silent again. I reached into my handbag and removed a thin folder before placing it carefully on the dining table beside the untouched dessert plates. Since we are discussing the future, I continued, there are a few updates everyone should know. Vanessa's expression shifted instantly. Fear. Real fear this time. I opened the folder and removed several notarized documents. 3 weeks ago, I established a new irrevocable trust protecting the house, land, and all associated assets. Daniel blinked hard. What? The property can no longer be transferred, sold, leveraged, or reassigned without my direct approval. I paused briefly before adding the next sentence. And after my death, the land will not pass to any individual family member. Vanessa looked physically stunned. What are you talking about? I met her eyes calmly. A significant portion has already been designated to a veterans housing charity and a regional land conservation program Robert supported before he died. It was almost fascinating watching greed collapse in real time. Vanessa's face drained of color so quickly she had to grip the back of a chair. Daniel looked at me as though he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. But he had forgotten something important. Mothers spend their entire lives learning their children. Eventually they also learn when those children stop seeing them as human beings. You gave it away? Vanessa whispered before she could stop herself. Not are you hurt? Not how could this happen? Her first instinct was still the money. Still the property. Still the loss. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks after hearing that question. Even Daniel finally turned toward her with something resembling disbelief. I carefully returned the documents to my handbag. No, I said quietly. I protected it from people who had already decided it belonged to them. Lily stood near the staircase clutching the edge of the railing with tears in her eyes. She looked heartbroken, not because of the property, but because children suffer most when adults expose what families truly are beneath appearances. I walked toward her first and kissed her forehead gently. None of this is your fault, sweetheart. Then I turned back toward the room one final time. Robert and I built our life from nothing, I said. And I will not spend the last years of mine sitting quietly while people wait for me to disappear. Nobody stopped me when I picked up my coat and walked to the front door. Behind me, the beautiful party Vanessa spent weeks planning had finally become honest. Winter arrived quietly after that night. The mountains around Asheville turned pale blue beneath cold morning skies, and for the first time in months, my home felt peaceful again. Not because the betrayal hurt less, but because uncertainty had finally ended. There is strange comfort in seeing people clearly, even when the truth breaks your heart first. Daniel called 3 times during the week after the party. I let every call go to voicemail. His messages all sounded the same. Tired, defensive, ashamed in ways that still protected himself more than me. Vanessa never called at all. That silence told me more than apologies ever could. But Lily came to see me the following Sunday afternoon carrying a paper bag filled with cinnamon muffins from the bakery downtown. She stood on my porch shivering inside an oversized sweater with tears already sitting in her eyes before I even opened the door. "Grandma," she whispered, "I am so sorry." I pulled her into my arms immediately because children should never carry guilt for the failures of adults. We spent the afternoon baking soup bread in my kitchen while snow drifted softly outside the windows. She asked careful questions about her grandfather and what the property meant to us when we first bought it. I showed her old photographs of Robert standing beside the unfinished farmhouse in 1985 wearing muddy boots and grinning like the luckiest man alive. "Your grandfather used to say land remembers who loves it," I told her quietly. "That is why some places feel alive." Lily stayed until evening, and before leaving she hugged me tightly and whispered something I still think about months later. "You are stronger than all of them." Maybe she was right. Or maybe women simply become difficult to manipulate after surviving enough disappointments. By January, life settled into a rhythm that finally belonged to me again. I joined a small volunteer literacy program at the local library twice a week. I started taking early morning walks beside the French Broad River with a group of retired women who laughed loudly and complained about their knees and carried peppermints in their coat pockets. Nobody there cared about inheritance or property values or who controlled what. They cared whether you showed up and whether you listened when someone spoke. Real community feels very different from performance. One cold Saturday morning, I drove out to the highest point on my property, just after sunrise carrying a thermos of coffee and Robert's old wool blanket. Frost covered the grass in silver-white layers while fog rolled gently between the distant mountains. I sat quietly on the hood of my truck and watched the sun slowly light the fields Robert and I spent decades building together. For the first time in a very long while, I did not feel abandoned. I felt free. People assume betrayal destroys you immediately. Sometimes it does something stranger. Sometimes it removes the illusion that was exhausting you all along. Daniel eventually wrote me a letter instead of calling. 4 handwritten pages filled with apologies, explanations, and promises to fix things. I read every word carefully while sitting at my kitchen table one rainy evening. Then I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside a drawer without responding. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. H teaches you that too. Some doors can reopen. Others should remain closed for your own peace. A few weeks later, Lily texted me a photograph of herself holding her college acceptance packet with the caption, "Grandpa would have cried." I smiled so hard my chest hurt. Because despite everything, something good had survived. Not the fake performances. Not the polished family dinners. Not the inheritance plans whispered behind closed doors. What survived was truth. And at 68 years old, sitting inside the quiet home they once tried to take from me, I finally understood something that took an entire lifetime to learn. The loneliest moment of my life was not the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped begging dishonest people to love me honestly,